Section 11 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9. The War of Tournai, 1511 to 1514. In 1512, Henry VIII began his attack on France in defence of Pope Julius II, and the causes of the war in which he was about to mingle require to be clearly stated, as illustrating the political feeling of the time, and as accounting for things farther on. It sprang originally from the jealousy of Venetian power, felt alike by the Emperor Maximilian, by Ferdinand of Aragon, by Louis XII of France, and above all by the Pope. Between these powers was formed in 1508 the League of Cumbre, so called from the secret negotiations at that place between Margaret of Savoy, Maximilian's daughter, and Cardinal d'Amboise as French plenipotentiary. Venice had of late been losing territory in the east, Lepanto, St. Maura, and others of her possessions having been taken by the Turks. Accordingly, she had wished to extend her dominions in Italy itself, and had seized Rimini and Faenza amid the confusion which followed the death by poison of Pope Alexander VI in 1503, thus controlling much of the seaboard of the Papal States. Her territories now included Ravenna, Treviso, Padua, Verona, Crema, and Brescia, and in ruling these she showed such a liberal spirit as to be able in time of trial to rely on them implicitly. She had even made the beginnings of a settlement on Neapolitan soil by lending Ferdinand of Aragon 200,000 crowns, and receiving in pledge the ports of Trani, Brindisi, Gallipoli, Pulignano, and Otranto. Besides this wide dominion, she was still the queen of maritime enterprise and trade, her supremacy not having been yet destroyed, in spite of the discoveries of Columbus and Vasco da Gama. Her factories still extended to the mouth of the Don, and her linen, gilt, leather, silks, and glass were, as we have seen, the best in the world. Moreover, printing had been established there within 15 years of its first invention, and carried to high perfection by the Aldi. All this magnificence excited the utmost envy in the poverty-stricken monarchies of Western Europe, the theory being, as Bayard puts it, that God was certainly angry with the Venetians for living so gloriously and gorgeously, and making such small account of the other princes of Christendom. Under these circumstances, a plan of spoliation was easily settled beforehand. The Pope was to recover Rimini, Faenza, and Ravenna, Ferdinand his Neapolitan harbours, without paying the sum for which they had been pledged, and Maximilian the noble cities of Padua, Verona, and Vicenza, with several others. For the conquest of these last, the King of the Romans was promised help from the native nobles, who hoped that the Austrian power would re-establish against their fellow citizens the feudal privileges of which the Venetian rule, favoured by the middle and lower classes, had deprived them. The war began disastrously for Venice, as her troops were terribly defeated, May 14th, 1509, at Agnadello, a village near Crema, where they had proposed to stop the French after their passage of the Adda. And so little were they able to recover themselves that the enemy advanced as far as Mestre and Fusina in the environs of Venice, and even threw some hundreds of cannon shot across the lagoon into the city. In the midst of this confusion the Venetians resolved upon a stroke of that magnanimity which seldom fails in political affairs. They released from their allegiance the cities on the mainland, and allowed them to make the best terms they could with the victors. This created such an enthusiasm in their favour that Treviso, Padua, and other places took the earliest opportunity of rising against Maximilian and returning to the Venetian rule. And when the King of the Romans tried to punish Padua for this, its stern resistance made him glad to raise the siege. Very soon the usual vices of a coalition had begun to show themselves. The French, too, offended Julius by taking Bologna from him, and were also promoting a church council at Pisa in opposition to his power. Ferdinand's natural jealousy of France had reappeared with her victories, while the Pope had already recovered Reggio, Mirandola, and Parma, and was ready to listen to the Venetian offer of restoring Ravenna to him. As therefore Julius had only wished to use the League of Cumbre for his own purposes, he now contrived, October 15th, 1511, a new treaty under the name of the Holy League, by which he himself, the Venetians, and Ferdinand were to expel the French from Italy. Against this coalition the French fought bravely under Gaston de Foix, taking by storm the city of Brescia, which was one of those most devoted to Venice, and utterly defeating the Spaniards at Ravenna, April 11th, 1512. Here, however, Gaston was slain, and the loss of the victors was so enormous that their power in Italy collapsed, and they found difficulty even in holding on at a few scattered points. At this point Henry VIII. Resolved to strike in with his fresh and unimpaired forces. He professed to be scandalized at the impiety of waging war with the Pope, who, he maintained, had no superior on earth, and must be borne with, however froward, but at the same time had the preposterous hope that he might reconquer France, though its population and revenue were 4 times those of England. On his marriage he had professed that he and Catherine would thenceforward be subjects of Ferdinand I. Now his astute father-in-law took him at his word, by inducing him to send a force to the Spanish frontier and invade France from thence, while he himself, thus sheltered from attack, was adding Navarre to his dominions. From the English point of view there may have been an idea of waking up old feelings of attachment to our rule at Bordeaux. At any rate, attempts to conquer the Garonne country were sure to be popular, as, if successful, they would make wine cheaper by half in England. Accordingly, an army of 10,000 men was organized by the genius of Wolsey, who had lately entered the king's service, and dispatched under the Marquis of Dorset to Fuenterrabia, where they landed June 7th, 1512. Ferdinand had promised that an army of his under the Duke of Alva would join them in the invasion of Guienne, but instead of making this good, he continued his operations in Navarre, while all kinds of misfortunes befell his unhappy allies. They found no tents provided for them, though the season was most rainy, and no sufficient provisions, though their own had been plundered by the mariners while they were seasick. The hot Spanish wines produced fever, and beer there was none. The officers were almost useless from inexperience, and discontent became rife in the camp, many of the men refusing to serve unless their pay was raised from 6d. to 8d. a day, as on the lower sum they were in danger of starvation. On August 28th a council of war was held at San Sebastian, and the army took the strange resolution of returning home without orders. In vain did Henry write to Ferdinand, desiring him to detain it by force. By October 7th they were on the way home, and a shower of epigrams from all Europe was preparing for the warriors so soon weary of the field. Unable, however, to fix the responsibility on any one in particular, Henry resolved, by the advice of his council, to let the matter drop, with the satisfaction of knowing that the influence of France had been increased by the failure of his attack thus far. Soon, however, an act of peculiar though unsuccessful daring came to restore both king and nation to better humour. In March 1513 Sir Edward Howard, with 43 vessels, sailed for the Breton coast as the forerunner of the larger expedition planned for the year, and longing to avenge the loss of the sovereign, which had been burned in the preceding August. He soon drove the French fleet opposed to him to shelter under the guns of Brest, where they fortified themselves in order to wait for 6 of their galleys from the Mediterranean. Hearing that these were near, and had anchored between two forts in water too shallow for his ships to approach, Sir Edward resolved to attack all 6 with the only 2 galleys which he had, being, it is said, stung by a hint from the council at home that in inviting Henry to command in person at the destruction of the French fleet he had wished to evade his duty. He laid his own galley close to a hostile one, and had already boarded her in person, when the vessels happened to part, and he was left almost unsupported on the enemy's deck. Unwilling that they should have the spoils of an English admiral, he threw his gold chain and whistle into the sea, and next moment was thrust overboard and perished. To reward the Howard services, Henry, after Flodden, restored Lord Surrey to his father's dukedom of Norfolk, dormant since Bosworth Field, and made Sir Thomas Howard Earl of Surrey. On July 26, 1513, Henry advanced in person from his city of Calais to join Maximilian at Aries, and was hardly less beguiled by him than he had been by Ferdinand. For not only did the poverty-stricken emperor obtain pay as Henry's soldier, but he induced him to attack 2 places not really important to his interests, but very much so to those of his confederate. These were Tehuan and Tournai. The former of these was a French frontier town just outside Maximilian's province of Artois. He had vainly striven to conquer it in 1479, and it had lately been a constant annoyance to his Artois subjects, who ardently desired to see it reduced and its fortifications levelled with the ground. Tournai, though in the rear of Maximilian's advanced dominions, had remained as a French outlier in his territory, and was therefore a thorn in his side. Both places were quite beyond the true line of an English invasion, which would naturally have been straight towards Paris. However, the siege of Tehuan was formed. On August 16th a French force under the Duke of Longueville tried to relieve it, but was defeated by a charge of Maximilian's men-at-arms, supported by the English army, an exploit which gained for the Emperor in England the title of the Second Mavors, and which the French, with a satire which did not spare themselves, called the Battle of the Spurs. The French general La Palisse and the celebrated Bayard remained prisoners. On August 22nd Tehuan surrendered, and on the 28th Tournai, in spite of the strength of its walls and gates. On leaving home, Henry had made Catherine regent, and in order to secure her position had ordered the execution of Edmund de la Pole, whose life had been promised in 1506 to the Archduke Philip. It is said that Henry VII had charged his son on his deathbed to regard the pledge as made for the reign only. During the French campaign, in fact on the same day as the Battle of the Spurs, James IV of Scotland, who had thrown in his lot with France, was defeated and slain by Lord Surrey in the Battle of Flodden Field. This disaster to Scotland is so well known that it is only necessary to notice its salient points. After capturing the castles of Norham, Wark, and Ford, James took up his position on the defensible ridge of Flodden, an offshoot of the Cheviots, between the Till on the east and the Tweed near Coldstream on the north, a proceeding which Surrey regarded as shabby in one who had accepted his challenge to fight the matter out on equal ground. James's camp had the Till on its left and an impassable marsh on the right, and was defended in front by the whole of the splendid Scottish artillery. It was therefore unassailable, and Surrey could only turn it. This he did splendidly by carrying his 30,000 men first by Wheatwood Bridge to the right bank of the Till, as if he were retreating to Berwick, and then back by Twistle Bridge, near the junction of the rivers, thus placing himself between James and Scotland. Borthwick, the commander of the Scottish artillery, entreated permission to cannonade the enemy while recrossing the river, but the distance from Flodden, which was 6 miles, would not allow of the guns being properly supported, even if they could be brought up in time. Surrey was therefore allowed to get clear over and form on the left bank before James was near enough to attack. Even when he did so, everything was mismanaged. The Highlanders, who for the first time in recent warfare were then fighting beside a Lowland force, were not allowed to rush on in the peculiar manner which made them formidable. The Scottish guns did little, while Surrey's were most effective, and worst of all, James himself, instead of acting as a general should, plunged into the fight as soon as his centre was engaged, in hope of meeting Surrey in single combat, and fell when he had all but reached his enemy, the chief men of his army being slain around him. His body was discovered among a heap of slain and wrapped in lead, but not buried, as he had died under excommunication. There is a sad story of its being shamefully misused some years after at the monastery of Sheen, a still sadder one that the Scots believed that he had escaped from the field and gone on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Nearly the whole of the Scottish peerage were among the 10,000 who fell, and of the gentry almost every family had lost one or more of its members. Well might the graceful and pathetic ballad which records the calamity say that the flowers of the forest were a weed away. Yet this overthrow of the ally of France did little to strengthen the confederacy against Louis XII., which was at this time dying of inanition. Julius II. Had died in 1513, and had been succeeded by the pacific Leo X., one of Linacre's young fellow scholars at Florence. Maximilian had been bribed off by the promise of Louis's daughter Renee for his grandson Charles, with the French claims on Milan for her dowry, and Ferdinand was content with his acquisition of Navarre and the Neapolitan ports. In a frenzy of anger at being deserted when Maximilian and Louis made peace at Noyon, Henry meditated the wildest schemes of vengeance. He grasped eagerly at the offer of a French alliance, and was ready even to stultify himself by helping Louis to recover Navarre. A marriage was to cement this new friendship, the French king having just become a widower by the death of Anne of Bretagne, and Henry's young and lovely sister Mary being still undisposed of, though she had thought of marrying the Duke of Suffolk. The poor girl was therefore sacrificed to the new alliance, Henry engaging that she should be allowed to please herself next time, and the bridegroom's age and state of health affording a pleasing hope that this time was not far off. In fact, indigestion and late hours soon ended the ill-assorted union, and Mary, resolved not to be again a victim to her brother's policy, married Suffolk privately on the earliest opportunity, and managed, though with difficulty, to disarm the royal anger by agreeing to pay a large sum yearly towards the expenses of her first marriage. Louis was succeeded, January 1st, 1515, by his cousin and son-in-law, the Duc d'Angoulême, under the name of Francis I, and from Mary's second and happier marriage ultimately sprang the great family of the Greys. We cannot but see that these campaigns left Henry and England politically where they were, except indeed that no one would now deny that the islanders were stout men of their hands, and good backers for emperor or king in a struggle. The sum spent must have been prodigious, for each archer was paid what would now be 6 to 8 shillings a day. Indeed, the war devoured the income of 12 years. Public order was for the time at an end. In 1514 the royal treasure wagons were robbed by a bold gang, of whom 80 were captured and executed, the rest escaping to sanctuary. Taxation rose to an astonishing height. Twice over in 12 months an income tax of 6d. in the pound exacted from the very day labourers between 2 and 3 weeks' wages. At the same time an act was passed in 1515 to restrain the rise in the cost of labour, naturally resulting from the drain of men for the army, of which the first draft is, as Mr. Brewer remarks, in Wolsey's own hand. The want of labourers in turn converted more fallows into sheep farms, still farther decreasing the rural population. Nor did the war deal more tenderly with traders, for besides the preposterous taxation which crippled them, their business was liable to interruption even by the quarrels of confederates as when Henry in 1515 stopped the export of wool to Holland and Zealand on some notion that Maximilian's grandson Charles had affronted him. Well had the war justified its dissuaders, and what was worse still, the notion that we ought to reconquer France might revive and renew it at any moment. It had also fostered in Henry the ruthlessness which his portraits alone would prove to have been natural to him, and which afterwards made his times of peace, like those of Alexander the Great, more dangerous to those about him than many battles would have been. Such is ever the bitter fruit of wars like his, alike causeless, ill-managed, cruel, and inconclusive as they almost always were. End of Section 11.